A team of archaeologists at the University of Oregon have found one of North America's oldest human-occupied sites in southern Oregon.
What if everything you know about human history in America is wrong? According to the widely accepted narrative, the first humans crossed the Bering land bridge from Siberia into Alaska around 13,000 years ago, before spreading across North America. But in 2011, when scientists began excavating an ancient rock shelter in the deserts of Oregon, they uncovered stone tools, animal remains, and signs of human activity buried deep beneath the volcanic ash. And when those samples were analyzed, the results showed that humans had already been living there around 18,250 years ago, more than 5,000 years earlier than the accepted timeline. But how did humans arrive here if the ice-free land route didn't even exist? And if they did, how did they survive in such a frozen landscape? To understand this, we first need to look at what we've long been told about the first humans in America. The Clovis First Theory. It was roughly 13,000 years ago, as the last ice age was beginning to end. Vast glaciers that had covered much of North America for thousands of years slowly started to retreat, reshaping rivers, valleys, and the landscapes we see today. At the same time, sea levels were far lower than they are now. Between northeastern Asia and present-day Alaska, a massive stretch of land emerged above the ocean. Known as Beringia, this land bridge connected Siberia and North America, creating a route that no longer exists today. According to archaeologists, it was across this bridge that the first humans entered the Americas. These small groups of hunter-gatherers followed herds of mammoths and other Ice Age animals in search of food. As the climate continued to warm, a narrow ice-free corridor is believed to have opened between two enormous glaciers, allowing these early people to move farther south into the rest of the continent. For decades, this wasn't just a theory. It became the accepted explanation for how the Americas were first settled. The reason was simple. Again and again, archaeologists uncovered the same kind of evidence. Across North America, they found distinctive stone spear points with long fluted grooves running down their centers. Unlike any tools discovered before, these became known as Clovis points, named after the town of Clovis, New Mexico, where they were first recognized in the 1930s. Wherever these tools appeared, they were found alongside the bones of extinct Ice Age animals and consistently dated to around 13,000 years ago. To many researchers, this wasn't just evidence of an ancient culture, it marked the beginning of human history in the Americas. Any site claiming to be older was usually met with skepticism because it challenged decades of archaeological research. Over time, the Clovis First theory became more than a hypothesis. It became the foundation on which American archaeology was built. But science has never been about protecting old ideas. No matter how widely accepted a theory becomes, it survives only as long as the evidence supports it. And in the remote deserts of southeastern Oregon, archaeologists were about to uncover evidence that the Clovis timeline could no longer explain. An ancient shelter. The Rimrock Draw site is located in Harney County, in southeastern Oregon. At first glance, it doesn't look like the kind of place that could change history. It sits in the middle of Oregon's high desert, where endless fields of silver-green sagebrush stretch toward the horizon. Jagged volcanic cliffs rise from the earth, while the dry remains of ancient lakes spread across the valley floor. Winters here are freezing. Summers are scorching. Even today, it feels isolated. Thousands of years ago, it would have been even more unforgiving. That is exactly why archaeologists never expected to find evidence of the first Americans here. The site itself is surprisingly small. It is not a deep cave, but a simple basalt rock shelter measuring only about 3 meters deep and 20 meters long. From the outside, there is nothing extraordinary about it. But sometimes, the most ordinary places hide the greatest secrets. And that is where the story begins. In 2009, archaeologist Scott Thomas from the Bureau of Land Management's Burns District was carrying out a routine cultural survey on this land. And that is when something caught his attention: plants. Thomas noticed that sagebrushes growing near the shelter were 7 to 8 feet taller than the surrounding vegetation. In a desert environment, that usually means one thing: there is deeper, wetter soil beneath the surface. And for an archaeologist, deeper soil means something even more important: older layers of sediment. Those buried layers can preserve evidence that has remained untouched for thousands of years. But how had these ancient tools ended up in the middle of Oregon's high desert? And who had left them there thousands of years ago? To find the answers, a full-scale excavation was organized. And what that team discovered would challenge one of the oldest and most accepted theories in American archaeology: the excavation. In 2011, Patrick O'Grady, a staff archaeologist from the University of Oregon's Museum of Natural and Cultural History, arrived with a team of students to begin the first systematic excavation, working alongside the Bureau of Land Management. However, they weren't searching for the oldest people in North America. Instead, their goal was much simpler. They wanted to study Ice Age animals and understand what happened as the world warmed after the last Ice Age. The team carefully began removing the layers of soil, expecting to uncover clues about ancient animals and the environment. But almost immediately, they noticed something strange. It started with the ground itself. See, the thing is, at most archaeological sites, the soil changes over time. The wind blows it around, rain washes it away, animals dig through it. Over time, all of this mixes the layers of soil together. That makes it difficult for archaeologists to know exactly when an object was left behind. But Rimrock Draw was different. The layers of sediment were clean, flat, and clearly separated from one another, almost like the pages of a history book. Some layers were dark because they contained charcoal left behind by ancient campfires. Other layers were made of light-colored silt, showing long periods when no one had used the shelter. Even more importantly, there were no signs that the layers had been disturbed. There was no evidence of animal or plant activity. Every layer remained exactly where it had formed thousands of years earlier. And this made the site incredibly reliable. It meant that anything found in one layer truly belonged to that layer. Now, the team had to be more careful. This wasn't the kind of excavation where people used large shovels. Most of the work was done with small brushes and tiny tools, removing the soil just a few millimeters at a time. Before anything was touched, its exact position was carefully measured and recorded in 3 dimensions. Photographs were taken at every stage because in archaeology, an object's location is just as important as the object itself. However, as the team continued the excavation, stone tools began to appear. And they were not scattered randomly through the soil. Instead, they appeared in specific layers, over and over again, at different depths. This meant that this place wasn't visited only once. People had returned to the same rock shelter again and again, over hundreds and possibly even thousands of years. But there was a problem. According to the Clovis First theory, people should not have been living in Central Oregon during the time represented by these deeper layers. Yet, here was the evidence. The geology made perfect sense. The sediment had remained undisturbed. The artifacts were exactly where they should have been. The team knew they had found something unusual, but the biggest discovery was still buried deeper underground. And when they reached the next layer, it changed everything. The camel tooth. In 2012, Patrick O'Grady's team reached a deposit that would become the centerpiece of the entire investigation. The team discovered a piece of jawbone and several tooth bones buried beneath the volcanic ash. Upon further examination, They eventually found that the bones belonged to Camelops hesternus, a giant camel that once lived in North America during the last ice age. Now, this wasn't the kind of camel we see today in Africa or Asia. Camelops was native to North America. It stood nearly 7 feet tall at the shoulder and lived across the continent's dry grasslands thousands of years ago. Finding its bones was exciting on its own. But where they were found made the discovery far more important. The bones were lying together in a small area. They weren't scattered across the ground the way they would be if an animal had simply died there or if predators had dragged the body apart. Instead, they looked like the remains of an animal that had been carefully butchered. When the researchers examined the bones more closely, they found something even more remarkable: clear-cut marks. Straight, clean cuts found exactly where a person would slice through muscle and joints while removing meat from the bone. For decades, archaeologists have recreated ancient butchering techniques using stone tools. The marks in those experiments matched the marks on the Camelops bones. That meant humans had butchered this giant camel. But there was one question that mattered more than anything else. When did this happen? To find that out, scientists needed to analyze the volcanic ash that had been covering the bones for thousands of years. Geologists had already identified that this ash came from a major eruption of Mount St. Helens more than 15,600 years ago. Volcanic ash spreads across the landscape and settles over everything beneath it. At Rimrock Draw, the ash layer was completely intact. It had never been disturbed. That meant the camel bones beneath it had to be older than 15,600 years. But the researchers wanted even stronger proof. Instead of relying only on the ash, they decided to date the camel remains directly. They used radiocarbon dating, a method that measures how much radioactive carbon remains inside once living material. To be sure, the results were accurate. The camel tooth was tested by 2 independent laboratories, including researchers Thomas W. Stafford Jr. and John Southan. Both reached the same conclusion. The camel died about 18,250 years ago. This meant that humans had been here 5,000 years earlier than the 13,000-year timeline proposed by the Clovis first theory. The camel tooth had delivered something close to a verdict. But the story was not finished. Because if humans were here that long ago, then where were the tools they used to hunt these animals? The stone tools. The answer to the tools question was waiting in the same layers of sediment. Archaeologists uncovered several stone scrapers lying beside the camel remains, while others were found in even deeper layers. These were not ordinary rocks broken by nature. They had been carefully shaped into tools. Thin flakes had been removed in a controlled pattern to create sharp cutting edges. The flakes were too neat and too consistent to have been caused by pressure, frost, or other natural forces. But then came something even more shocking. The scrapers were made from orange agate, a bright, fine-grained stone that is not found naturally around Rimrock Draw. The local landscape is made mostly of basalt, while orange agate comes from locations dozens of miles away. That meant the people who used these tools had either traveled long distances to collect the stone or obtained it through contact with other groups. Either way, it revealed something important. These were not people wandering across the landscape. They planned ahead. They knew where to find the best stone for making tools, and they carried it with them over long distances. The picture became clear when they looked at these tools under a microscope. The edges showed tiny wear marks created by repeated use. These patterns matched the damage seen on experimental stone tools that archaeologists use to butcher animals and scrape hides. The Rimrock Draw scrapers showed the same type of wear. These tools had not been made just to be discarded. They had been used many times. And just when researchers thought they had seen enough, they discovered a scraper in a layer deeper than the camel remains. Because the sediment at Rimrock Draw had remained completely undisturbed, the tool had to be older than the camel bones. That meant people were already using Rimrock Draw before the camel was butchered around 18,250 years ago. And when all of this evidence is put together, the story becomes clear. These people were not here by accident. They returned to Rimrock Draw again and again. The microscopic evidence. At this point, the camel bones had been dated to around 18,250 years ago. Stone scrapers had been found beside them and even deeper in the sediment. But scientists wanted one final piece of proof. This time, the answer was too small to see with the naked eye. It was hidden inside the stone tools themselves. For decades, archaeologists have used a method called residue analysis to study ancient tools. When a stone tool is used to cut meat, scrape hide, or butcher an animal, tiny traces of blood and proteins become trapped inside microscopic cracks on its surface. Once those traces dry, they can remain sealed inside the stone for thousands of years. And unlike dirt or water, this kind of residue cannot get there by accident. Wind cannot put blood inside a stone tool. Rain cannot wash it into tiny cracks. The only way it gets there is if the tool was actually used on a living or freshly killed animal. To test this, researchers selected several scrapers from Rimrock Draw that already showed signs of heavy use. Rewriting the history. When you look at all these discoveries together, one thing is undeniable. Humans were already living in Central Oregon around 18,250 years ago. But there is one major problem with this. At that time, there was no ice-free corridor between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets. The route that the Clovis first theory said people used simply did not exist. So how did people get here? The answer many researchers now support is a different route. Instead of traveling through the middle of the continent, the earliest people may have followed the Pacific coast. Even during the Ice Age, much of the coastline remained open. Rich coastal waters filled with fish, shellfish, seabirds, and marine mammals could have provided food along the journey. Researchers often call this route the Kelp Highway, because long stretches of kelp forests would have supported life all the way from northeastern Asia to the west coast of North America. Now, Rimrock Draw isn't the only site where the contradicting evidence is found. At Paisley Caves, just over 100 miles from Rimrock Draw in south-central Oregon, researchers from the University of Oregon recovered fossilized human feces, coprolites, containing ancient DNA dating to approximately 14,300 years ago. The DNA linked these people to populations from Siberia or Asia. Even more interesting, the stone tools they used were different from Clovis tools, showing that more than one culture already existed in North America before Clovis technology appeared. In southern Chile, the Monte Verde site has yielded evidence of human occupation dating to at least 14,500 years ago, thousands of miles south of the Bering Strait. The people there used seaweed for medicine, built shelters from wood, and consumed a wide variety of plant foods, a level of adaptation that takes generations, not years, to develop. The same pattern appears even farther south. At Monteverde in southern Chile, archaeologists found evidence of people living there at least 14,500 years ago. Even farther north, at Bluefish Caves in Canada's Yukon, researchers found animal bones with cut marks dating to around 24,000 years ago. One site after another, the dates keep getting older. And together, they all point to the same conclusion. The first people reached the Americas much earlier than once believed, and they likely traveled by more than one route. However, there is one catch. Researchers have not found any human skeletons, pottery, or permanent homes at the site. Those discoveries may still be buried deeper underground. The problem is that the excavation has not yet reached the bottom of the site because of limited funding and the need to protect the fragile layers. As a result, no one knows what those hidden layers might reveal about the earliest people in America. They could hold evidence that pushes the story of human history back even further. So, what does rimrock draw really mean for history? It means our understanding of the first Americans may need to change. If humans were hunting giant camels with carefully made stone tools in Oregon around 18,250 years ago, then they arrived much earlier than many archaeologists once believed. It also means we may need to rethink how they reached the Americas, the routes they traveled, and how advanced they were during the Ice Age. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to give a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for amazing stories like this. We'll see you in the next one.